Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Francesca Joseph. I'm a pediatrician at Children's National Hospital, as well as a member of the FDA-funded National Capital Consortium for Pediatric Device Innovation there. I began my career in pediatric devices back with the FDA. I was a commissioner's fellow there, where I worked on various initiatives to advance the development of pediatric cardiovascular devices, and also served as a medical officer later on in the Office of Orphan Products, where I was involved in the humanitarian use device program that is the precursor to the HDE device pathway. And then my co-presenter today is Nicole Ibrahim. So go ahead, Nicole.
Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Ibrahim, and I have the pleasure of presenting with Francesca this afternoon. I'm the Division Director for the Division of Circulatory Support, Structural and Vascular Devices in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices at the FDA. I'm a biomedical engineer by training, and I've been with the agency for over 10 years in various positions as a reviewer and in management. And I have been involved in multiple internal and external efforts to promote pediatric device development for cardiovascular devices, device applications. It's been one of my passions, and I'm happy to be a part of this effort and with you all today.
Thanks, Nicole. And many great minds went into the evolution of this presentation today, particularly our lead and co-lead, Amra Rachik from Medtronic and Eric Chen from Abbott, as well as the many names you see there. It would not have been possible without these variety of views and perspectives, AdvaMed, industry, FDA, everything, and CPAS as well for all their support. So thank you all. And as a repeat from previous presentations, but just to remind everyone what the SHIPMD is and seeks to do, is to improve public health for children, and it's aimed at transforming the pediatric medical device ecosystem by de-risking and accelerating developmental processes and stimulating investment and innovation in pediatric devices. There are three phases. We're currently in the first phase, where we are holding this workshop to present the anticipated value proposition of the framework, and then get feedback, deliberate these ideas throughout the next 2 days, to end in a go or no-go decision regarding phase 2, which would be the consortium phase, and then ultimately a phase 3, where SHIPMD will become a standalone entity. For the regulatory work stream, our directive was to explore opportunities to address regulatory needs by refining the current regulatory process. So what can we do now with the current legal framework that we have? And then considering new regulatory options to further develop pediatric medical devices, de-risking the medical device ecosystem for pediatrics as a whole, facilitating device approval and review using existing data, expand regulatory programs and tools, and I'll go into that more later, and then in general, enhance clinical trial knowledge amongst all stakeholders. So here I just want to review the actual definition of pediatrics in medical devices. It is different from drugs for those that are more familiar with that side of things. In drugs, pediatric is less than 17 years old, but in devices, it goes from birth through the 21st year of life to up until the 22nd birthday. So I just bring this up. There's a later slide that's relevant to this, but it creates this odd gap at the upper age, or not gap, it's an odd overlap at the upper age groups there. So many companies will do quote unquote adult trials with 18 and over. An 18-year-old can sign their own informed consent, independent, and then they will, if they get approval, they technically have a pediatric, population on the label, pediatric label, but it just skews the view a little bit. If you look at total numbers of pediatric devices, without the breakdown by these ages, sometimes it can look even, when you look at the younger age groups, there's even more of an unmet need there. So just important to keep that in mind. So the road to pediatric innovation is long and winding in many ways. The regulatory challenges are multiple and often overlap with some of the other areas as well, from earlier work groups. But there are ethical considerations. There may be a public perception, that research in children is unethical. Parents can be reluctant to enroll their children in trials if they don't see a clear benefit, and they don't want to have their children get extra blood draws, extra X-rays, or whatever the case may be to be a participant in the trial, understandably. So there's also unique device design concerns, especially with things like implantable devices. You have to consider the growth and development of the child, or even if they're, not implantable, there's other sizing things and different concerns for this population. The affected patients are small, maybe not just in body size, but in number. Any given disease may not have a ton of actual patients affected. Things like congenital heart disease, for example, is very heterogeneous. The anatomy is different, even though they're all under the same umbrella of congenital heart disease. And they can be geographically dispersed, across the U.S. and even across the world. So it makes clinical trial design challenging. Sample size considerations are a challenge. Your gold standard randomized control clinical trial that you see in the drug world may not, often can happen in device trials. So in many specialty areas, the clinical population is relatively small, and equipoise between device treatment and, say, surgical treatment may no longer exist. Sometimes off-label device use by clinicians has become standard of care. When there is no device available for your patient population, pediatric practitioners have become very good at, jerry-rigging an adult device to work for their patient, in the best interest of their patient if they have no other choice. And in some cases, they've been so successful, it's become standard of care. But then when it comes to randomizing for a trial, that certainly creates a barrier and makes it even more difficult to conduct. So there's understandable difficulty in assigning children to a surgical control arm when there's an alternative catheter therapy, for example. So in the cardiology world, parents may view, or just in general, the medical community may view that catheter option as better, safer, even though there may not be actual clinical trial data out there. It's just from real world experience. So all of these things create the need to entertain alternative clinical trial designs to encourage enrollment of pediatric patients. So use of things like concurrent unrandomized control, registry data, historical data, and even statistical, Bayesian statistics and things like that. But the point being, it's complicated, and it takes a lot of great minds and smart people to kind of figure all of this out. And hopefully SHIPMD can help prop up that system to facilitate all that knowledge and keep all these things moving. And then finally, there's some uncertainty in requirements for device development sometimes. So, even things like biocompatibility, things that are tested on adults, based on body weight, can that be extrapolated to pediatrics? It's uncertain, things like that. So a complicated world. And medical device legislation is not new. Dating back several decades, you'll see there's lots of legislation along the way. I just want to point out a few that have become, there's been some baby steps or big steps even along the continuum. We're targeting pediatrics specifically. So in 2007, one thing that I'll just mention is that there was legislation, Congress authorized the funding of the Pediatric Device Consortium Grant Program, which has been reauthorized several times, currently exists in 5 locations around the country. And these nonprofit consortium help pediatric device developers move their products along the development process in various ways. And they've had successes, and hopefully we can continue to build upon that. There's also been things such as there was a restriction that was lifted in 2007. So previously HDE devices were restricted from making a profit, but then there was legislation to try to incentivize pediatric development by removing that restriction. So if it was a pediatric HDE, there was no restriction on the profit. You could make a profit from those devices. So just little things have been done, but on the drug side, there's been legislation that has had a huge effect. The Orphan Drug Act, for instance, and generally the BPCA and PREA on the drug side has often been called the carrot and the stick. So that PREA legislation requires that drug or biologic application include pediatric data, and then the BPCA will actually extend the market exclusivity an additional 6 months for if there's pediatrics. So it's a big financial incentive, but as has this been discussed over many years, it doesn't exactly translate to the device world. The patent protection is not the same for devices. It's an iterative process. You're constantly tweaking the design, so that patent protection is not the same of a thing as on the drug side and doesn't afford that much of an incentive. So, part of what we're discussing today is how a system like SHIPMD can help to incentivize and really process the pediatric device ecosystem. And this is just a visual about kind of where we've been over the past decade, what has come out. So this is for PMA and HDE devices. So these are the class 3 highest risk devices, sometimes highest reward. But those blue bars are the pediatric. And I just want to kind of reference back to the earlier slide. I think the slope of this curve might be even flatter if we considered the smaller subpopulations. Because some of the devices included in these numbers are actually for the older age groups. But even still, overall, that slope is much less steep for those blue bars for pediatric devices versus the rate of rise for the adult devices there. So going up in a lot higher. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but just to lay out the current regulatory framework. So on the left there are the available marketing pathways for medical devices, not just pediatrics, adult medical devices. And then, depending on risk as well. And then pediatric specific guidance documents are there on the right, just showing there are, especially in the last several years, been publication of pediatric specific guidances that can really help developers kind of navigate the pathway. Sometimes they can be hard to find, and if you don't know to look for them, then you can't find it. So I'll get more into that later. So SHIPMD, to advance innovation and early access. So from the regulatory perspective, our work stream kind of broke this down into 4 areas, and I'll go into each in more detail later. But one being regulatory programs and tools. What could SHIPMD provide there? Benefit risk analysis is the second. Creating an FDA Liaison and SHIPMD champion. These concepts, again, I'll go into more detail. And then finally, a resource portal for information and education. So for regulatory programs and tools, we want to explore the expansion to optimize the current breakthrough device program. So this is something we could do now as the program currently exists, the breakthrough device program. As it stands, it is not specific to devices. It's not exclusive of them, and many pediatric devices do get breakthrough designation, have gotten breakthrough designation. So it can be done, but it's just not specific to pediatrics. It's also currently not coupled with reimbursement for pediatric devices. So anyone who's listened to the reimbursement work stream already, or hopefully you will tomorrow, they get into that in more detail, but at least not through Medicaid, because Medicare, through the MCIT rule, is covering breakthrough devices, but that's not, Medicaid is not included there, and that's a big player in the pediatric world. But there's lots of benefits to that program, more interactive and expedited pre-sub and review process with the FDA, the sprint discussions, and if you can get that designation, it's a big advantage there. But can we do more? So SHIPMD could provide structured recommendations for the designation of each device application approved by SHIPMD as a separate pediatric breakthrough device for priority consideration by FDA in a new pediatric breakthrough devices program. So this is a bigger boulder to push up the hill. It would require lobbying and legal action, but if it's something worth pursuing, that's something we wanted to talk about today. And then we talked about the impact on reimbursement, meeting unmet needs of pediatric patients overall. And then finally, leveraging clinical evidence generation infrastructure through the members of the SHIPMD. And we talked about how how the clinical trials can be a little bit more complicated and hard to enroll, so this is important. Now, benefit risk analysis. So stakeholders would to access SHIPMD clinical and network expertise to guide and better understand the benefit risk analysis. This would be at the request of the sponsor, innovator. FDA would be able to access the SHIPMD clinical and network expertise to guide and better understand an accurate benefit risk analysis and other questions regarding pediatric populations and subpopulations. So, depending on the disease and the device, I think there was a question yesterday that came up in one of the panels, when will FDA be willing to take on more risk? Well, the information needs to be, everybody has to be communicating. So even parents, of children affected by diseases, if there's no alternative and the difference is death or the device, that they would be willing to tolerate a much higher risk than, say, a less urgent situation. But these things can be difficult to understand, but really bringing all those stakeholders to the table, making the FDA aware of the situation, having pediatric clinicians that know those things, and communication, and really kind of delving into, what's reasonable and what makes sense for each specific product and the disease it's going to treat or diagnose is important. So innovators would also benefit from a single contract process. This has come up before. So to streamline things with each individual, hospital of the SHIPMD would be a single contract process and then a single IRB. Usually what's happening now, when you have to go to each individual IRB at each institution, it's tedious, it's time consuming, but SHIPMD could streamline this into a single place. It also, some institutions are very used to drug and biologic trials, which, as we know, not even just from my talk today, but from others, it's very different. So, this IRB at least can ensure that there's device expertise on that review board. Now, this concept of an FDA liaison. So FDA would appoint or establish in each CDRH review office this position. And that person would act as a resource within FDA for questions regarding SHIPMD as a whole. They would facilitate interaction with the review team, meet with the SHIPMD members at the request of the innovator to discuss progress and promote communication, and may also attend regulatory meetings at the request of the sponsor. So really providing that support and communication. And then the FDA to explore establishing a centralized office for pediatric innovation could be a further step. And then also a SHIPMD champion is the term we're using, but this would be a member of a qualifying hospital whose clinical expertise is matched to the product and disease to help shepherd that product through the regulatory review process. Again, whether that be providing input on that benefit risk analysis, other things along those lines, and easier facilitation of regulatory interactions and discussions through that role as well. And finally, a resource portal. So I mentioned briefly before, sometimes there's information out there, but it can be hard to find. And again, if you don't know to look for it, it's even more impossible. So, you might be developing a device and not even be aware that there's a guidance document relevant to your device. So kind of housing these things all in one place, anything that is pediatric device developer might need would just be in one place. single source of information, things from guidance documents, real-world evidence considerations, data extrapolation, the pre- and post-market balance, which can become, very much a part of the conversation in this area, and other regulatory programs linked to pediatric medical devices. And then helping with enhancement of the life cycle and facilitating access to stronger regulatory strategy through all this education and resource availability. And then I'll pass it on to my colleague, Nicole.
Thank you, Francesca. So Francesca went over a number of the areas that our work stream covered in terms of developing what we thought were some promising ideas for how SHIP could provide some regulatory support for innovators. And so this should look a little familiar to you. This is just to sort of put it to practice in an example. So this is the current timeline that an innovator for a pediatric heart valve might be looking at. And it starts from the time of, ideation or conception all the way through to the pivotal study that might be used to support a marketing application. And this would be, it would typically include early prototyping, bench and animal testing, hopefully eventually a design freeze of some sort, and then move into the manufacturing and verification and validation testing that would be used to support entry into the regulatory space. So that would typically start with a pre-submission meeting with FDA that would hopefully then lead to an IDE, an EFS or early feasibility study IDE, followed by a pivotal study. So what are the potential areas where SHIP might be able to help with this current timeline in terms of both regulatory strategy as well as making the timeline perhaps more efficient? Next slide. So these are the areas where we brainstormed within our work stream. So, and again, these are sort of an example, and so the timeline here is a little bit approximate. So these, the SHIP points of entry could shift depending on the product and the device area. But thinking potentially that the innovator could enter SHIPMD just before, perhaps the design freeze stage, where at that time they would begin to engage with the SHIPMD champions and FDA Liaison. And so they would have a representative both on the SHIP side as well as on the FDA side that can begin to engage in the regulatory strategy. Following the design freeze, SHIPMD could provide the regulatory services in terms of the information portal that would help to support use of some of the regulatory programs, the existing regulatory programs, and guidance documents and location of information that could contribute to this enhanced timeline. Following that, the pre-submission meeting could occur, and at that time, both the SHIP champion and the FDA liaison could attend, and it would really be an opportunity to provide open communication between the review team as well as the SHIP champion and the liaison. Following that, there was, Francesca mentioned the opportunity to help put context around the benefit risk analysis for a particular device, emphasizing whether there's an unmet need or certain unique clinical considerations related to the patient population or the device itself. And that would be an area where the SHIP champion could help contribute to that conversation and presentation of that type of analysis to FDA. Then following the manufacturing design and GLP animal study, as well as verification and validation testing, again, SHIP would be able to support the innovator by attending pre-submission meetings, and at that point would be able to engage with FDA to be able to convey not only some of the benefit risk analysis information, but also perhaps some of the other considerations that are unique for the device. Hopefully, quickly thereafter, the early feasibility study could commence, and after collection of maybe some preliminary data to show the potential for effectiveness and the safety profile of a particular device, SHIPMD could help support putting together a breakthrough designation request. And SHIP, being familiar with the criteria that are required for breakthrough designation, would be able to work with the innovator to put together a robust presentation of information that would then be submitted to FDA for the breakthrough designation request. So this is just sort of an example of how we think some of these aspects that we've discussed today could fit within the timeline of a Class 3 pediatric device, a heart valve in this case. Like I said, some of this can vary, but this is sort of the general picture of what we've envisioned in terms of regulatory support that SHIPMD could provide. Francesca, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Nicole. So in summary, SHIPMD seeking to add value, de-risk, declutter, and streamline the regulatory process, which is shortening the time to market and making everything simple to use. And now I invite, I'm looking forward to a good panel discussion as our panelists join us in answering some questions from the audience.